everyone. How are you? Please continue to grab drinks. We are going to get things underway here. Hi, I'm Shannon McGregor. I'm an associate professor here in the Hussman School for Journalism and Media, and I'm also a principal investigator in public life. I'm really excited to welcome you all here today. I have a few logistics before I get into talking about the matter at hand. For our panelist attendees, we want to let you know we have a tab at meantime and coffee later during the day. If you are here for CLE credit, please come see us after the panel. We have a QR code that you can scan for the CLE credit. And then I also want to say that we're thrilled to be able to provide some copies of the book that we are here to sort of launch, Media in January 6th, over on the table, as well as some copies of books by scholars that are here today. We have Francesca Tripodi's The Propagandist Playbook, Khadijah Costley-White's The Branding of Right-Wing Activism, and Daniel Young's Wrong, Media, Politics, and Identity Drive Our Appetite for Misinformation. So please feel free to grab those from the table whenever you would like. I also want to take a moment, and I hope you'll join me, in thanking CITAP's Corbin and Felicity for all the work they did to help organize this event. So I mentioned that I'm with CITAP, so I want to take a second for those of you who may not be familiar to tell you who we are. So the Center for Information Technology and Public Life is an interdisciplinary research center here at UMC with an intellectual commitment to communication for a stronger democracy. Our interdisciplinary research center is truly our collaborative network where we create theoretically rich, empirically sound, and compellingly told scholarship that diagnoses and translates the stakes of power imbalances for journalists, policymakers, and the public. With a focus on people, platforms, and power, our interdisciplinary approach provides unique insights into how technology intersects with social inequalities and power structures. And through our scholarship, teaching, and the dissemination of our research, we create this sort of essential body of work across multiple fields for house professors here in the School of Journalism and Media, the Department of Education, School of Information and Library Science, Department of Sociology, to try and create this sort of body of work that's grounded in our shared commitment to equality and justice. And it's that same shared commitment that led us to the volume that we're here to talk about today, Media on January 6th. So let's think back to when this report from the House Select Committee first came out, detailing what happened on January 6th. Across the 104 pages of text, the summary of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol's core findings mention the media just 2 times and social media just 6 times. The committee's report is obviously deeply important for our country, for diagnosing what happened and holding those who took part in the attempted coup and the insurrection of that day accountable. But it has an ultimately narrow focus, this report, and it obscures the role of the media and its relationship to politics in fomenting this attempted coup on January 6th. And so, in our book here, which again, you can find copies of on the table over there, we bring together 24 chapters that make clear that an understanding of media, of history, of the relationship between communication and social identity, and the reinforcing dynamics between media and politics are necessary if we are going to fully grasp what happened that day and the implications of that day and our time continuing since then for democracy. So this volume came together following an event that we had that brought together scholars across multiple fields, many of them part of the larger sort of Knight Research Network. Here at CITAP, we co-hosted this event with George Washington's Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics on the 1-year anniversary of January 6th. To our knowledge, this was the only event across the multiple fields that this sort of network represents that tried to make sense of and account for what happened that day and the role of media, political behavior, and sociology in this. And so, reflecting on this shared commitment to a true multiracial democracy in the US, the discussions that we had that day on the event marking the one-year anniversary and the subsequent chapters that are collected here in this volume center historical and contemporary racial, ethnic, and power dynamics within the context of media and information and communication. This is sort of what we tend to see as our brand here at CITAP. And we argue both at CITAP and in this volume across all the contributors that absent a focus on these things, we failed to see how our country can understand and withstand our ongoing and future threats to democracy. So the contributions in this volume lay out what we see as a very promising research agenda at the intersections of democracy and media, which we really urge scholars to take up. There are, and there will be, more calls for deflationism, accusations of partisanship, of alarmism, but as a recent New Yorker piece pointedly asks, when does a commitment to deflationism risk turning into denial? And so for those who value and support a truly multiracial democracy in the US, we see this as sort of an all hands on deck moment. And so I'm really honored to be on the front lines and on the deck, so to speak, with the intelligent and committed folks that contribute to this volume and who are here today. And so with that, I would like to introduce our first panel, Understanding January 6th, and welcome our guests from this panel up to the front. So we have Scott Althaus, the Merriam Professor of Political Science, Professor of Communication, and Director of the Cline Center for Advanced Social Research at the University of Illinois. Also join me in welcoming Danielle Brown, the 1855 Community and Urban Journalism Professor and an Associate Professor at Michigan State University School of Journalism. And welcoming two of CITAP's own, first Alice Marwick, an Associate Professor at UNC's Department of Communication and a CITAP Principal Investigator. And Francesca Ciprodi, Associate Professor in the School of Information and Library Science, newly tenured. Let's please give it a round of applause. With CITAP. So in this panel, we're going to consider how should social scientists, media scholars, policymakers, journalists, and the public at large understand what happened on January 6th. The researchers on this panel, all of whom contributed to the volume, will discuss the work that demonstrates what happened on January 6th was an attempted coup that was grounded in the political interests of the outgoing president, his supporters, and members of the Republican Party, as well as the political coalition that they represent. They'll analyze how media, communication, and rhetoric were central to laying the groundwork for January 6th, as well as how the events on that day unfolded. So each of our presenters here is going to give a brief statement. Then we'll have a discussion, and then we'll invite questions from the audience. So, thank you. Scott, I will turn it over to you.
Do you want us on podium or here?
I think just here is good, yeah.
Great. Yeah, I've got a timer going.
I love it.
Hi, I represent and direct the Cline Center for Advanced Social Research at the University of Illinois. Our mission is transforming information into knowledge that advances human flourishing, and we do that by documenting human conflict at scales ranging from small acts of protest or political violence all the way up to coups and what follows from that. We have a variety of projects that are designed to produce highest quality academic data sets that get released to the public, so that people who have interest in human violence in its various forms can draw the highest quality inferences based on the data that we can help to provide. And we cover the range from documenting police shootings in the United States to documenting protests historically from the 1940s all the way up until the present. But one thing that we're known for is curating the world's largest registry of coups and attempted coups and coup conspiracies for every country in the world from 1945 to the present. And when our team witnessed the events on January 6th, we understood immediately that because of the unusual mission that we operate in, we had an opportunity to help people understand what are the labels that at least the Cline Center team would use to categorize what we're seeing unfolding on the screens and then the days following. And there were lots of different options within our definitions. It's clearly what we would call a politically motivated attack. It's clearly a mass expression event. It was a very complex event. Lots of people doing lots of different things, probably for different motives. So very difficult to assess, but one of the key questions that we wanted to dive into is whether our coup d'etat project was relevant for what happened. And in the weeks that followed, from January 6th, a team of 6 of us were voraciously consuming the reporting, what little legal documentation was starting to emerge at that point. And by the end of January of 2021, we released a public statement defining this as an attempted coup, according to definitions that the Cline Center had been using since 2013. So this isn't anything to make it up after the attack. And our definition, just so you know, is a coup is an organized effort to effect sudden and irregular, that is illegal or extra-legal removal of the incumbent executive authority of a national government, or to displace the authority of the highest levels of one or more branches of government. So that's what a coup is. And you can have coups that are attempted. You can have coups that are sort of in the air, but there's never any plans. There's different kind of elements of them, but all of these elements to meet our project definitions have to satisfy 5 criteria. The first is there needs to be some person or persons who initiated the coup event. It can't have just sort of spontaneously happened. Second, the target of the coup must have meaningful control over national policy. So kind of when the KKK overthrew the government of Indiana in the 1920s, that wouldn't count as a coup for us because that's not national policy. There must be a credible threat to the leader's hold on power. That's the third. And we could see already on January 6th that those first three criteria were already met. So for our team, it was the next 2 that were the important ones to assess. The fourth criteria is there must be illegal or irregular means used to seize, remove, or render powerless the target of the coup. And fifth, it must be an organized effort. So these 2 were difficult for us because it was not clear whether the motives of at least some part of this group were to usurp power of Congress or merely disrupt the operations of Congress as a protest, which the event on the ellipse behind the White House was a protest demonstration. So we needed to get down to that, and we needed to also assess to what degree this was just a spontaneous event. In the Cline Center definitions, a spontaneous eruption of violence is a riot. But if it's not spontaneous, it's not a riot in the Cline Center's terminology. And it is not a riot. So we found in the weeks that followed sufficient evidence to document that one or more groups did indeed intend to usurp the power of Congress, and one or more groups did indeed organize themselves for violence on that day. It was not purely spontaneous. My 5 minutes are up. We have 2 subcategories of attempted coup that have been appended in our data set for this event. The first, the initial one that we came out with was what we call an attempted dissident coup. That's disaffected civilians, people outside government. It's a pretty common kind of coup event around the world. And after the select committee's investigations and the many court cases that began revealing more dispositive evidence about motivations and what was going on behind the scenes, we later made a second determination that this was also an attempted auto coup. An auto coup is a coup that involves the current executive authority trying to either disrupt a transition to a duly elected next authority or to otherwise illegally extend their term in power. So the Cline Center's coup d'etat project classifies this as both an attempted dissident coup and an attempted auto coup. And in our way of explaining things after these classifications were made, we tried to help journalists and citizens who are very upset about what they're seeing to just see how an academic organization can calmly walk through a definition and see this is how our project definitions apply to this case, and none of us ever thought that we'd be applying those definitions to these things.
Contribution to this conversation in many ways is based on trying to think through and talk about what you shouldn't call it. So very much, there are lots of words that it could be called, and when I was working on some of the work for the chapter in the book, I was watching different words unfold, right? And as those words were unfolding, like this is a protest turned into a riot, very much I wanted to make sure that we use the right language, coup d'etat, right? But also that we didn't use the wrong language until we could figure out what the right language was. And so if you hear anything, this was not a protest and it was not a riot either. And that's very much what my work suggests. The central focus of my work is not on conservative uprisings. Actually, it's on the representation of Black Lives Matter, particularly since the uptick of protest activities since 2012 globally. A lot of my work has focused on Black Lives Matter, but also has compared it and contrasted the representation of it in media with other protests that have happened. So like in 2016 and 2017, I looked at the comparison of Black Lives Matter and some of the protests around the very, what is called a model of nonviolent protests, the Women's March, right? And how this legitimized protest effort to on behalf of women and women's rights, which was large and massive and global, was not met with much constraint from police. This was also legitimized in media coverage and given its due diligence as a legitimate political piece, whereas Black Lives Matter over the course of many years and be legitimized in media coverage routinely has not been shown much more. They assume that you understand that racism is an idea. They assume that you believe that racism is bad or that it exists at all, and don't write in all the ways that it manifests in the lives of Black people as sort of the core base behind what that protest is. So in 2020, it was really interesting, or 2021, it was really interesting to be able to have a new comparison, a place where we also knew some of the fundamental baselines of what was being talked about, the vote or the election being rigged, that was also not real in lots of ways, right? And so the comparisons of that led a lot of work to show that the media also delegitimized the January 6th attacks. They called it protest at first, and then moved over to talking more about their actions and less about their baseline, which is the same pattern that the media has used for Black Lives Matter. Many people are like, aha, it's the same, they're all bad, right? And that's not the point here. The point is that the realness of the demands and the grievances around racism in the United States are like the election results the election fraud that was the basis of the claims for some of those protests. So in the end, I really have two takeaways. One is not to call January 6th a protest, which was very much what all of the frontline coverage of this was. It was very much, it started off not as a protest against something because you can't protest things that aren't real. But it was a rally, which is rooted in the word of recovery, right? And the idea of not of being able to get back together after you've been defeated. This was a rally at first that turned into something else. Very much after the media decided to change the language as they realized this doesn't work inside the protest constraints or the word protest, they moved to the word riot. And there's a lot of things around the reason why the word riot is inadequate, but it's also important to consider the cultural context in the United States of when we use the word riot. We talk about the race riots, we talk about the riots that followed the killing of Michael Brown, we talk about riots that followed the killing of Freddie Gray. We talk about the riots in Minneapolis, where I was on ground zero, and people still tell me that city is on fire. And so the use of the term riot not only is inadequate, but it keeps that sort of false comparison that what was happening on January 6th is very similar to what is happening in the charge to try to make the United States a more racially equitable space. And so that's sort of my contribution to this is the idea of thinking through the realness of what some constraints are and using language that is different, that is not rooted in the democratic processes or in the United States democratic history, or the denial of that to describe what we're seeing in this authoritative period.
Right, so for the last 4 years, I've been studying far-right online radicalization, and I'm interested in how people come to believe extremist, conspiratorial, and fringe ideas they encounter primarily on social platforms online. And when we think about January 6th, there's often a popular and even an academic discourse that the participants in January 6th did so because they were radicalized as a result of far-right disinformation. I have a long list of examples in the book chapter, but for example, Andrew Kidd wrote in the scholarly journal Violence that the attempted coup was the result of, quote, radicalization of the conservative movement and the Republican Party. And Michael Edison of the Southern Poverty Law Center similarly wrote that the January 6th participants were the victims of mass radicalization. But this is despite the fact that it's quite clear that Trump and many other Republican politicians aided, abetted, and planned and encouraged the January 6th rally or the January 6th event. But it's not immediately clear what anyone means when they use the term radicalization. Like, this is an actual scholarly term that has a really big literature that is associated with it. And it's really complicated. For one thing, it can mean people who take on extremist political ideals, which is not illegal in the United States, or it can be people who commit acts of extremist political violence, which is illegal in the United States. But I think we have to really understand radicalization and where it comes from in order to understand why it's an inappropriate term to use in this context. Radicalization comes into play after 9/11. It comes into play in a highly Islamophobic context in which Islam is seen as the radical other of something that is so exterior to American ideals that the only way that anyone who is born in Western Europe or America or living there would ever take up those ideals is because they have been radicalized, right? And it assumes this set of radical ideas that are outside the mainstream, which really doesn't make sense with the United States' well-documented history of white supremacy. And the belief that the 2020 election was stolen is extremely common even to this day. A survey conducted by Robert Cape at the University of Chicago found that 47 million people in the United States believe that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump and that Joe Biden is an illegitimate president. And among Republicans, surveys consistently, even really recent surveys, find that about 70% of Republicans believe the election results are illegitimate. And the Republican Party has repeatedly characterized not just the January 6th insurrection, but election denialism in general as, quote, legitimate political discourse. So this week, the RNC, now headed by Lara Trump, released a scripted robocall. And I want to quote from this robocall for y'all. They claimed that the Democrats committed massive fraud in the 2020 election. Quote, we all know the problems. No photo IDs, unsecured ballot drop boxes, mass mailings of ballots, and voter rolls chock full of deceased people and non-citizens are just a few examples of the massive fraud that took place. If Democrats have their way, your vote could be canceled out by someone who isn't even an American citizen. So if we're talking about political beliefs that were promoted by the top people in power and that are still widely believed to this day, how is this in any way radical? How is this other way exterior to mainstream American politics? So I would like us to think about this as more the result of mainstreaming extremist ideas than of radicalization. And mainstreaming is a really well-documented far-right political strategy. They call it metapolitics, and it's the attempt to inject white nationalism or the rejection of liberal democracy not just into mainstream political discourse, but into mainstream culture in general. And in multi-party Europe, Europe has many political parties. And what we've seen is the rise of a bunch of far-right political parties, which unfortunately now are gaining significant power across the EU, such as the National Rally in France, the Forum for Democracy in the Netherlands, and the Swiss People's Party. But in the United States, we only have two parties. So the far right has strategically decided they are going to mainstream their ideas through the Republican Party, and this has been an extremely successful strategy. First, we see the increased prominence of far right ideas in public discourse, such as the Great Replacement theory, which posits that Jews are attempting to replace white people with immigrants and other people of color for nefarious reasons. And even though this theory tends to be anti-Semitic and focus on foreign-born immigrants, recent research from GW's Andrew Thompson, who's here today, finds that mere discussion of demographic changes in the U.S. generates strong anti-Black considerations that drive support for political violence and in other words, far-right domestic terrorism. The second is the increased extremism of mainstream Republican political ideas and the leveraging of far-right ideas by establishment politicians to increase and maintain political power. It is not that there is a clear, bright line between the right and the far right. When we're talking about things like anti-trans disinformation, anti-immigration policy, anti-BLM rhetoric, it's just a question of intensity rather than a question of difference in content between the right and the far right. All right, I'm out of time, but my main point is that January 6th is better framed as a result of mainstreaming far right and conspiratorial beliefs in ordinary Republican conservative politics and a radical break with the status quo. Thank you.
I actually, it was like such a beautiful little sound. I thought it was my stomach.
I know it's a robot alarm. My 3-year-old picked it.
I love it. Anyways, I'm Francesca Tripodi. I'm super excited to be on this panel. I see so many connections between our work. I've been thinking about search engines for quite some time, or how the way people find information validates their already existing worldviews. And a book that is here, and I hope you take it, explains how powerful politicians and pundits wield the power of search engines. And I'm thinking a lot about how now this translates to AI initiative now, and that this disinformation effort is steeped in white supremacist logic. So I look at how search engines fuel disinformation and lead to organizing efforts that ultimately harm society. And in the chapter for the other book that's also there, and I really hope you all take it, I focus explicitly on the deep historical legacy of election fraud in the United States and how it's tied to racial injustice. So I think about less in the idea of mainstreaming extremism and more about the role extremist white supremacist logic has played since the founding of the United States, and also the deep role that plays in terms of perpetuating power. So on January 6th, we saw what happens when leaders are trying to deny free and fair elections. And among the many lies that then President Trump was spewing on that day were, I would say, maybe the less egregious, but equally harmful, was this idea of crediting his supporters for inventing the phrase "stop this." And what I'm doing in the chapter in the Media in January 6th book is thinking about how that legacy of Stop This Steal is definitely not the invention of MAGA Nation. In fact, if you look at trend data and look at archives of Twitter, Stop This Steal first started surfacing in 2016 when Trump thought he was going to lose to Hillary Clinton. He didn't. So then figured out, you see it spike again in 2018. It was actually part of the DeSantis campaign. That worked in their favor, it petered out, and then you see it peaking in 2020, all the way leading up to the attempted coup on the United States. But collectively, what I think about is how the story, or what Arlie Hochschild, sociologist, refers to as deep stories, is tied to this idea of Stop This Steal. So deep stories are a concept created by sociologists that refers to narratives that are told and retold so frequently that you don't even have to actually hear the whole story to know what they're saying. These are stories that feel true, even if they aren't exactly accurate. And the story of election fraud in the United States goes something like that. Others, whether that be Jews, immigrants, Black people, women, members of the LGBTQ community, are trying to steal or influence those who should control power in the United States. Read white Christian men. But this story is like so old. And what I have found by looking to the scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, who is a really famous sociologist, and actually Daniel is here. He's the one that initially had me take a look at this work as well. So he writes in the book, Black Reconstruction in America, the very last chapter, W.E.B. Du Bois in the 1930s is using the phrase misinformation to think about how capitalists rewrote history books to make it seem like Reconstruction was the fault, the failure of Reconstruction was the fault of Black persons, not white people in power, white men in power. And shortly after Black persons received the right to vote, and they elected a record number of Black men to serve in U.S. Congress, we see lies starting to circulate that African Americans had used their voting privileges, engaged in corruption, and stood generally unfit for democracy. And so we use this lie to strip away rights. And what we see is that by using this lie, we see this increase in voter ID laws. We see a justification for redistricting, aka gerrymandering, right? And that by activating this lie over and over and over again, it then justifies the logic that it's like, okay, to walk, to storm the Capitol and try to overthrow the government of the United States. So I'm really excited to talk more. I feel like there's so much overlap, and I'm done.
So, I think all of this discussion already so far, showed how media, communication, rhetoric were really central to laying the groundwork for January 6th and what unfolded on that day. But one of the points that all of you sort of talk about and make, and one that I will credit to my advisor, Regina Lawrence, as being one of the inspirations for a lot of my work, is that words matter. The specific words that we call things matter, right? This is a common theme that we see across, sort of what we're discussing here today. So I want to put to you, why do words matter? Why is it so crucial that we call January 6th an attempted coup? That we call fascist silence what it is and not characterize it the way that we might call spontaneous silence or even protest. That we call extremism what it is, that we delineate between radicalization and mainstreaming. So why are these words so important? And I think also to layer onto that, for whom is it important that these words are precise?
I'll start.
We're all being so polite and respectful and giving space for each other, so no one is talking.
Well, that was the central part of your argument, is the words that matter. So why don't you start and then I'll.
Okay. Okay, so I think words matter because it's how we understand things. I mean, we're like literally you saw what happened on January 6th and you understood it, but we don't know how to visually understand things the same way, and words help us give sort of a shared across idea about what things are. They help us talk about it in our language. Literally, we don't have a visual capacity to do that. So while people saw what happened on January 6th, words are what make it possible to say, no, that was Antifa. Mm-hmm. Or as someone told me on the plane on the way here, I hope you'll talk about how it was a step. To make Trump look bad. That's all that happened. That's all she saw on January 6th. So the words we use help give us information about how we understand the visuals we don't tend to teach substance about. And I think that, for me, especially as I think about the continued history of our civil rights struggle for Black people in the United States, it's really important that the words that are used around things like race and racism, they don't have visuals that people want to see. They don't have visuals that people tend to understand. And in many ways, as we've eradicated Jim Crow, but then created new kinds of racist principles and institutions through the United States that aren't as visible. They can't be seen, so we need the right words to be able to talk about them and co-opting them with other things that are visible, like if January 6th is a riot and Black Lives Matter is a riot, then you can think of these things in the same way, then you can delegitimize them in the same way, but that is simply not the truth, right? And so I think that, you know, the very direct and specific articulation of what we say is the only way we're going to sort of dig ourselves out of the hole we've dealt ourselves in our cultural context in the US.
Yeah, so I'll add on that in two ways. I think a lot about how the words we use shape our queries, and then that shapes the information returned to us. So the way people see the world is very much, it activates this starting point that then feeds back information that can, in many ways, reconfirm lies, right? But then I also think about, and I use the work of Sophia Noble to complicate and think critically about the way that corporate and political interests are complicate this even further. So what we see, even if you did a Google image search of the word riot versus the word protest, and see what kind of images come up. I haven't done that. I don't know yet. Just saying, I'm guessing based on Sophia Noble's amazing brain, that we'll see what we're gonna see. And so, yeah, how we classify phrases are really important, but then there's also a larger infrastructure of how people get the facts or verify truth, and that is
words sort of activate larger concepts and imaginaries, right? So when people use the term radicalization, they're tapping into this discourse, and it's like this lone wolf guy sitting in his mom's basement looking at 4chan, and then he goes and does something horrible, right? And that's just not, it pushes responsibility from the sort of collective responsibility of people who are in positions of power or positions of influence who are spreading this rhetoric. And it also tends to often push responsibility onto the social platform rather than the mainstream media or the state, who are often overlooked, obviously not today, but often overlooked when it comes to the role of spreading these kinds of ideas. The other thing I wanted to mention was that a lot of people, when talking about January 6th, will describe it as an act of domestic terrorism. And I have been thinking a lot about this lately because in the United States, we don't have a federal criminal statute for domestic terrorism. We have a foreign terrorism, and we have organizations that are designated as foreign terrorist organizations, but we don't have organizations that are designated as domestic terrorism. And that's because of the First Amendment, because there's a fine line between legitimate political expression and when that political expression tips into violence, right? So if you had just gone to January 6th and people had like waved their QAnon flags around and marched up and down, that is legitimate political expression, right? It's like when they break into the property, when people get injured, that's when it becomes an act of political violence and thus terrorism. But it's very nice to think about like, oh, well, we should have that. We should have a definition of domestic terrorism. But the problem is that when you build those types of things into the carceral logics of American politics, they often go to places we don't want them to go. So right now, Georgia has a domestic terrorism statute. And it's an expansive statute that allows for domestic terrorism to include any sort of attack on infrastructure, which again is widely defined. And right now outside of Atlanta, there's an attempt to build a large police training facility known as Cop City. And there have been a lot of abolitionist activists down protesting against the construction of Cop City. And Georgia has used this domestic terrorism statute to prosecute them. So for these like 19-year-old kids who are looking at 25 years in jail for basically what I would consider to be legitimate political protests. So I think that when we think about how the state apparatus works in all of these ways, I think we need to think about public discourse, but then we need to think about how that public discourse gets instantiated, because it doesn't always work in the ways that we would like.
Words matter in part because some words evoke legal consequences. The word sedition has a very specific role in the U.S. federal code. Treason is another one of those. But I think for our purposes and thinking about media and the role of communication and helping people to understand what to make of an event like January 6th, I think words evoke categories, and it's important to align the categories so that people can understand what to make of this thing that they've just witnessed. And that's why I think the category of coup is a very appropriate one, because it's an exceptional form of extralegal political power exercise. And in the United States, since the Civil War, we haven't had one. We can talk about before the Civil War, but so this is something that is not typical for this country, even though This is a country that has a long history of political violence, just a lot of it. And in our cultural spaces, particularly dominant cultural spaces, there's this curious double-mindedness about remembering the nice story of America and forgetting about, from revolutionary times on, tar and feathering was a very violent, people died from tar and feathering, right? And then we move on up. There's just been violence all along the way. But this is a different kind of violence, and it has important ramifications that suddenly takes a country like the United States and places it in a category of Thailand and Iraq, maybe, and we are not maybe as special and maybe not as insulated from some kinds of political upheaval as we may have thought before January.
Thank you for perfectly doing that next question I was going to ask. So we're talking about words. A word that we hear so much today to describe today's politics, to describe January 6th, is unprecedented, right? Apologize to my family. When I listen to NPR in the morning, I yell a lot, and I especially feel like, when I hear unprecedented, I'm like, but as the book and of y'all's contributions and our discussion even here today demonstrate, none of what happened on January 6th was unprecedented. So I wanted us to take a moment to think about, why does this word, get used so often, and what are the implications of this exceptionalist framing around our current political moment and around January 6th?
I think I could very quickly say, I think it's called unprecedented because we've erased all the other times.
Yeah.
We've been really great at erasing all the other times that we've done this kind of work or we've seen this happen in the United States.
I think some people would say it's unprecedented because when have we seen Confederate flags flying in the Capitol building? When have we seen a angry crowd taking over? And I would, and on that definition, there may be a reasonable case that that particular constellation of things maybe hadn't happened before, but it turns out Akil Amar and Vic Amar, two law professors, and Stephen Calabrese filed an amicus brief for the Trump v. Anderson case, which was the 14th Amendment case of whether Colorado could throw Donald Trump off the ballot. And they document in that amicus brief that there actually was a previous insurrection attempt before the Civil War by the outgoing Secretary of War, whose name is John Floyd. And he not only positioned military forces so that they could be easily taken over by the southern states that would become the Confederacy, so the Treasonous Act, but that he conspired to thwart the peaceful transition of power when Abraham Lincoln was elected, and actually had gathered a crowd ready to do the thing that we saw on January 6th. So even in this case, it's not unprecedented. And now we know.
I think America has a lot invested, and especially American media has a lot invested in this idea of us as this like wonderful, patriotic, free country. And that extends down into the sort of attempts to control the way American history is taught by focusing on the sort of jingoistic patriotic myths of American democracy, rather than, as Danny said, like the actual events that happened. Like I didn't learn about the Tulsa Race Massacre until I was in my 30s. About it by watching the frickin' Watchmen on HBO. Like that is, and I am a PhD who minored in history. Like that is, I mean, and you can say that's on me, but I think it's also on my teachers and also on the system of education, right? And I think that we fully push forth this sort of mythology of the way that America works, rather than acknowledging the reality of how America works and has worked, and that is everybody's stuff.
I think everyone said most. I will just add the role academy plays in this perpetuation of this lie, right? I mean, in the fact that I have a PhD in sociology and I didn't read Du Bois until I graduated because he wasn't in any of the theory classes. And so I think, this isn't unprecedented, but if we keep pretending, if we keep writing about it like it is, we are part of that here.
And I think by using the term unprecedented and like continuing to sort of this like exceptionalist idea, that's what you said earlier, Danny, it means we're not going to be able to, it gives us no hope in ever dealing with the deeply like racist history this country and moving beyond into better, you know what I mean, type of country, if we continue to sort of embrace this exceptionalist framing.
I have to say, unprecedented also sort of like adds in this exceptional thing, like this is just a once, this happened, it's a one-off, this only happened once.
Don't worry about it happening again.
And lots of people aren't, like, as we approach a new election season, lots of people are like, it's gonna be okay, we'll be fine, we learned our lesson, and I think that this word is deeply problematic as we roll into this election season, because if it does happen again, can it still be unprecedented? Or do we just have to scale up? Like, it brings a lot of questions.
Yeah, yeah. And I also think that unprecedented gets used so much, particularly by the media, because where media system is set up, you know, around engagement and attention in sort of the capitalist way that it is, unprecedented is like, oh, right? Like this is like an exciting thing. Like I need to see what's unprecedented, right? Like that word engages us and it engages these deep stories that we tell ourselves, right, about America. And so I think there's also a sort of profit and attention economy aspect to using the word unprecedented as well. So, you know, we have been talking about this across all of these sort of discussions. But, you know, I think I wanted to just see if there were other things people wanted to add. And, you know, we talked about this some, but like the way that race in this country shapes how we describe and define these sort of things that we're talking about. Protests versus riots. What is this information? And the way that race has shaped and continues to shape the way that we sort of think about these things. And how does it do that? And what are some of the implications of that in terms of trying to understand happen?
Well, I'm happy to give my disinformation spiel.
Do it.
Okay.
I was kind of hoping you would.
So a lot of people frame disinformation as just like incorrect information on the internet. But when we think about like false information that is strategically spread for ideological reasons, we have to think about things like the welfare queen narrative, anti-trans disinformation, lies about immigration or immigrants and the propensity to commit crime. What we find is that disinformation is a primary way in which systems of power stay entrenched. If you think about empire, there's these whole colonial systems of race science that justify sort of empire and settler colonialism. And this is used to justify in present day legislative and political processes. Like there's this huge body of anti-trans disinformation that is being used to do everything from ban gender affirming care to banning drag shows, right? And if we don't call that stuff out as disinformation, if we don't label it as disinformation, it's really easy to overlook the strategic role of information and knowledge. And it's also easy to overlook the power of the state in maintaining an that's my disinformation spiel.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this really great book, I'm forgetting the name of it. Thicker Than Blood. And it talks about the role of racism in inventing statistics, right? And how it plays in a key part of what we learn as valid science and how we attain this like pure science and how it's rooted in disenfranchisement. So yeah, just adding to that. I'll get that. I couldn't remember it off the top of my head, I'm sorry.
I would just say that I think that the problem, one of the biggest problems that we are going to embark upon is the comfort of isolating the unprecedentedness, right, of January 6th in a space where we can sort of conflate it with other kinds of riots and things like that, which is part of the reason I wrote the chapter. But the problem with making it a one-off or making it seem like it's exceptional is one, it did set a precedent, right? But also two, it makes people who are maybe moderate comfortable of saying, oh, that's not us though. But as someone who's now lived in both the reddest and the bluest of states, I can tell you that moderate middle is very, very frustrating as many of activist predecessors have said. And so I think that, everything I've talked about in this race, so I struggle to like find something unique to say, but I think that one of the things that we have to that one of the reasons, another reason why the language that we use is so important and the way we think about and talk about what happened is so important is because we don't use radical words that we've only associated, and this is very American of us, but like with other people, like coup d'etat, that's not us. That doesn't happen here, right? But if we have to use those words, if that's what it takes to say this isn't regular, this isn't normal, this doesn't happen in the scope of the United States as you know, whitewashed as you've learned it, right? Like this isn't normal, and if we don't look up, we're gonna be like that Netflix movie with Jennifer Lawrence, right? Like we have to, and
I would love to just also expand and say, I think the phrase and concept, our understanding of what democracy is, has been very whitewashed, and like not even recognizing that the exclusionary powers that many are fighting against is like baked into that system. So it's often working like as intended when it excludes. It was not created for all to participate in. There were very specific things put into place to ensure that not everyone got to vote. And so I think we just recognizing that like, the normalcy of what we think of as democracy isn't even really what was created in that space.
I think one last thing to mention about the racial dimensions that you raised is who's passing the first round. And if you are familiar with the terrific work by David Weaver and Lars Wilhoit looking at surveys of American journalists, it is the case that overwhelmingly professional journalists in the United States are white and male, and there's a particular cultural lens that just sort of occupies those spaces. So it becomes challenging to the extent that at least parts of this country are still dependent in some way on this professional news system to look for information that has a chance of being corrected or for political figures that may be popular, but there's a system in place that might hold them accountable a little bit. That is still kind of baked in with a cultural resonance that is going to make it difficult to see some of the dimensions that we're talking about this morning. The challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that's not the only reason, but one of the reasons that we get things, the phrases like racialized, or like a racial statement rather than like a racially tinged commentary rather than racist, right? Like that is one, you know what I mean? In the ways that we end up with phrases like that instead we had actual words for, right? But the press has largely been hesitant to apply those policies. I want to have time for the audience Q&A, so I just want to ask one last question of everyone, and then we'll move in and hear what you all would like to hear more about. So we talked a lot about what we've learned, how we can use what we know, the research that we've done, others to understand January 6th. What do we not know? What lessons or takeaways have we not learned about January 6th? What are some of the things that we might still not know or haven't really sort of taken of what happened?
I don't think the media has figured out how to cover Trump yet. I think it's been years and years and they still haven't figured it out. The guy is a troll. The guy is like an expert media manipulator. He reminds me a lot of Paris Hilton in the early aughts. Like Paris was like the best at getting attention from the tabloids. Like the infrastructure of supermarket tabloids, like okay and hello and everything would not, like Paris was beholden to them because she played into exactly what they wanted. And so she was on the cover every single week. Trump is exactly the same. He puts out outrageous statements. He says inflammatory things. And every single time the media is like, oh my God, we have to cover this because Trump said it. Trump said an outrageous thing. There's no context. The news cycle just constantly gets, upset or distracted. So I think it's just a shame. I think that's very disappointing to me. And I think, as Danny said, I think the both sidesism, I think the idea that you have to equate these things when one side is saying like, oh, we don't believe in multiracial pluralist democracy. And the other side is like, hey, maybe we should give people health care. Like maybe let's not both sides of that.
One of the things that I personally don't know is which like as important as it is to create adequate language and words around certain ideas and things, but which words are going to get new definitions based on a new set of expectations seemingly false. So I'm thinking like, how is DEI, right, been revolutionized? How will these words be revolutionized in ways that will inevitably keep in place the existing power structures and be used for the people who are trying to do good for society? I don't think we can predict which word is going to be next fully. I know like democracy is a word. It's on my radar as something that is something we should look out for. We've done some social listening in the Midwest and seen that there is conversations, they're not rumbles, are not whispers, they're now like small rumbles about how democracy wasn't listed in the Constitution, and so we're not a democracy, we're a republic, and we should be talking about a republic, and the liberals want the democracy. This isn't about democracy, which to me is kind of like terrifying in lots of ways, because democracy was at least, even though I have wildly critiqued it, not being accessible to people who look like me, but it at least gave like a moral background for this is what equality would look like if democracy were fully available to people that look like me. And so I think that one of the things we probably will need to write, you guys should could at another is what words and how did words change, and how did the way we decided knowledge was knowledge change in a way that actually it was very destructive for us.
Yeah, I'll do a quick plug over my book, because I do talk about this in my book pretty extensively, like how keywords are co-opted, like what you're talking about, but also there's a whole PragerU video on why we're not a democracy and why democracy is actually harmful, because we are a republic. It's the exact same word. So I would imagine the people in your group have watched that video, because it talks about how a true democracy instigates mob rule. And then it equates mob rule with non-white. So it is like definitely a huge thing. And yeah, it's like it is a Prager is actually one of their most widely circulated videos called Why We Need to Protect Electoral College. And it talks about, and it looks at the Constitution and talks about it as a republic. They also use the federal frequently to justify that.
And the word democracy, when you're talking about how that it's going there, like, I absolutely agree, like, it's totally jumps. Like, I was helping to design this survey, and we were gonna be asking about, like, what are some things you think are important to democracy? How important are these different aspects of democracy? There are questions that are asked by the World Values Survey, that are asked around the world, and have been for decades. And when we did some testing about using them, folks in the US, people who identify as conservative inherently put a partisan label onto the word democracy. So we had to use a different word. We had to just say like, because if you use the word democracy, people were activating sort of part of interesting finding in and of itself, but not what we were, necessarily trying to go for in during that.
If there's anybody in the room who wants to hear what is this thing should be great about?
Catch me during one of the breaks. I'm happy to walk through the difference. But I would say there's another thing that is underappreciated about January 6th, and that is the decades of media policy that helped to foment the kind of feverish rhetoric that I'm not making an argument about, it's deterministic, but go back to the 1980s, the rise of talk radio, the deregulation of broadcast, and then in the 90s, Fox News, and then they're making money, so MSNBC flips to an advocacy model of journalism, and we get now platforms that operate who knows how and are hardly regulated at all. And I think that it's very important for us to understand two things. One, that what we saw manifested on January 6th was a product of several decades of changes in communication ecosystems, and that means it's not going away anytime soon, unfortunately. But secondly, that communication scholars might have some important things to say, to our policy world about how to think about safeguarding the civic health of a country by maybe drawing a few lines around things. I'm not going to suggest particular policies here, but it is interesting that if you look even today at where news audiences congregate, it's national network news and it's local news. And once you go into kind of extreme parts of social media landscape and so on, there's a really long tail with lots of small little audiences. And it means that that legacy media system is still a really important player in this space. And we should be thinking about how we can help to get some of the knowledge in this room, I think, out to the policymaking community to just safeguard our ability to maintain ourselves as a society and safeguard against some of these more extreme forms of rhetoric that
We have little bit over, Alyssa's helping me, a little bit over 20 minutes left. So we would love to hear what questions you all might have for specific folks on the panel, for everyone to sort of get their teeth on. Yeah, yeah.
So all of us, when we visit the Capitol, we have to go through 3 layers of security, right? And so I think January 6th was a big intelligence failure because, people knew about it, but they did not do anything. And even President Biden at that time commented that if the race of the protesters were different, it would be a more people would have died on the protester side. But I also wanted to tell you that, that's perplexing. That's also unprecedented going back to what you said. But it's kind of amazing that the media really has a love and hate relationship with Trump, even after 3 years, where he describes all these protesters as hostages, and the media just covers it without even having a disclaimer, like as you know, in some cases. So I think that January 6th as a moment, as a media moment, will always be controversial and a dark moment in our life. Thank you.
So we're kind of talking about words, naming things. I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on what we should be referring to or calling the Republican Party itself. It's still repeatedly called conservative, center right, right wing, far right. I think if we're going to be stuck with this 2-party system, then we should have an accurate way to call a party that is behind all of this. So I'd love to get your thoughts on what should we call the Republican Party today?
I mean, we can call it whatever we want, but the way a bunch of academics characterize the Republican Party is not going to have widespread social impact, right? I mean, maybe the point is we need precision. We need to be very specific. But I would say that the Republican Party is still fairly large and diverse, right? And it has a lot of different viewpoints, and I mean, large and diverse in terms of maybe some very finely distinguished conservative viewpoints, not large and diverse in terms of racial, ethnic diversity. But I think I'm more comfortable saying, there's a discourse, there's far right discourse or far right policy that is being pushed by the Republican Party rather than.
I think it's important to point out sort of how counter-majoritarian, you know what I mean? The parties, I don't know if that can be a label, but the fact that they are participating, using the levers sort of democracy and of our democratic institutions to erode those very same institutions, right? Because the only way that the party as it is constructed now could maintain power is by exclusion, is by eroding fragile, inadequate democratic institutions that we have. And so that's too wordy to be a label. It's not a label. But I do think the stakes of those things are important to point out because I think they're important for the public to think about when people are thinking about who to vote for, when they're thinking about how to identify, right? That this is not, as it is now, a party interested in seeing what people want and enacting that, right? It is sort of going very much the other way and excluding to do what they want, which are by and large not policies or attitudes that are endorsed or supported by the majority of the American.
I think one other thing to mention about parties is that it's kind of strange because in the American context, we always have had two parties. The only successful third party electorally has been the Republican Party, the dissolution of the Whig Party in the 1850s. But parties remain private organizations. They don't have a public role, even though we assume, I mean, they have public implications, but they are private organizations, who also are protected by state level ballot laws, and so it's more complicated than that. But yeah, so how to categorize and how to think about them is an interesting challenge. I think one of the challenges that we're seeing today is because of the history of the latter part of the 19th century, it is exceedingly difficult for third parties to appear on ballots in some way that could contest a national election. There's a long history for that, but this is kind of one of the moments that wouldn't it be nice if it was a little easier for some alternatives to show up and help us navigate through this.
We have
Oh, we have a Zoom question. Okay.
I believe this is directed towards Scott. Someone would like to know that more about the national constraints with the definition of coup, specifically relating to the insurrection that occurred in Wilmington in 1898, because they see a lot of similarities between January 6th and the event in Wilmington. So they'd like to know more about the implications of like the national level in terms of that definition of coup.
So I get to escape that question by saying our project starts in 1945. But obviously, anybody who is involved, and many in this room have been, in collecting systematically organized data sets, knows that you have to make some difficult decisions about what's in and what's out and things like that. And so really, as a matter of just parsimony, the Cline Center's project beginning in 2013 really only focused on displacement of national political authority as the thing we're going to talk about. But it is certainly the case that there are all kinds of subnational coup-like events. I don't know about Wilmington, but I mentioned the KKK takeover of Indiana, which many Americans don't know about. There's a terrific book by Timothy Egan called The Fever in the Heartland. And yeah, the Klan ran Indiana and was pretty good in Oregon and in Colorado as well in the 1920s. And yeah, so there are lots of events that involve a displacement of power, political power. But at least in the Cline Center's project, we're only focusing on national level things as a way to just try to manage the scope of what we're trying to do.
Great panel. First, I wanted to ask about, so we've come sort of to this consensus that words matter and that words as they are used in academia matter, but to Alice's point, we can call it whatever we want, but that doesn't mean that journalists are going to follow. How do we actually get these definitions once we sort of decide them to transition into media coverage of these things? Like, what would that mean?
Yeah, I mean, it means doing things outside of just our university. It means inviting, like we have today, people who are not just academics, to these kinds of conversations. It means writing and speaking beyond sort of these walls. And, I think that is one of the core things that we at least try to do at CITAP, and that I think a lot of the other folks here today do also, is not just sort of writing in our academic journals that, make millions of dollars and are behind library paywalls, but like writing and speaking to other places. I'm sure many other folks here could say the same thing, but, when you, if you end up in contact with a journalist, like your sort of hope at sort of its most transactional level is that like you'll get quoted. right? Because then there's like a public display of like, okay, you did this thing and like, wow, you're important, you're in the New York Times or whatever. But most of the conversations, at least that I have with journalists, are like very long conversations explaining, you know what I mean? Some of these things we're talking about here to them that never culminate in a quote or an appearance, you know what I mean, on a broadcast. And I think there are a lot of people sort of engaged in that work. I don't think it's been adequate, you know what I mean? So I think we need to continue to work on that. I will also just say that in 2020, some folks here and many other scholars sort of across the country sort of established this group, the Election Coverage and Democracy Network, where we were trying to provide very public, easy to understand information to journalists about what to call these things, how to deal, you know what I mean, with some of these issues that we're talking about today. Some of this was pre-January 6th, and then we had to update some of what these guys look like. But you know, I'll just echo some of what I said earlier in regards to Lorcan's question, which is I think one of the roles that we can also have as academics is to try and provide sort of the baseline for journalists to make those assertions that are hard for them to make, that are outside the normal terms of political coverage. So provide them the research to say, this is anti-democratic, right? Here's how you should define the stakes of what's happening in an election where we have a whole party basically dedicated to, at this moment, undermining democracy. So Daniel Kreis is here, and Lisa Jang who's here, and myself and Eric Rice or Eric Peterson at Rice have come up with this idea of like democracy framed election coverage that really argues that going beyond just pointing out that, like, for example, 2020 is a lie, that it is also deleterious to democracy to elect people, right, who are going to work to undermine it. And so pointing out sort of the stakes of these things for democracy in that coverage, I think the role that we can play as academics is also to provide, like, we can be the baseline for that so that journalists don't have to say that themselves, even though these are all facts. But this is a new thing, and it's, you know what I mean? It's hard to sort of change those norms. So I think that's one, I don't know, if you guys have other.
Yeah, I think really long conversations with journalists that go unseen and basically unpaid. Those are fun. And you know, the public engagement piece of it, of being able to make it part of a more public conversation is really important. But I think that, like, there's a scale to this. And I know Meredith Clark there in the back has done a lot of advocacy on, for example, capitalizing the D in Black. There was a lot of advocacy after the murder of George Floyd about paying attention to police violence, that Sarah J. Jackson and myself are also really, you know, involved in, like, make this part of your public conversation. You have to think about police and how they act at protests too. And so I think that, you know, that there's a combination of long conversations, of you having your own conversation in a public space, of conversations. I do a lot of consultations with newsrooms and editors of trying to help them understand, well, your journalist wants to use this word, edit it out. Because of the long conversation that we had. Maybe we could have more conversations at ONA or, you know, at professional journalism conferences. Can we make an institutional change? But I think that, you know, in the end, while we can help sort of guide and prompt and encourage movements to continue, it's really hard to sustain them. As you know, as you probably know, in 2017, the AP style book was like, hey, you should start calling racist things racist. And that was a hot mess because I looked at coverage of that, like, okay, so did they start doing that afterwards? And sort of looked at how institutions, mainstream news institutions, were able to implement some of these things. And quite honestly, they're afraid, right? There's fear in using these words. There's fear in using words that make people uncomfortable. There's fear in discomfort, right? And so I think that there's not like a tried and true path, but there is certainly some kind of like gold star merit, Girl Scouty badge thing that I feel like you get for participating in this what has to be a multi-institutional effort to get people to understand how much words matter.
So, question for Alice. I'm really interested in the idea that term, like framing people or describing people as having been radicalized, that you know, takes responsibility off of Collective and off of Elise. These global anecdotes on platforms, like that's very intriguing to me. And I find that a compelling sort of argument. But I also am interested in the sort of normative role that media play in highlighting that these individuals and their actions are outside the norm, and we are therefore describing them as deviant. Like they are deviant, they don't fit in the normal curve, so therefore they're bad, and we should all attempt to avoid that crazy. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah,
that
no, I
tension
do.
between them.
I mean, do you think that's good, that describing people as radicalized in this context sort of points to the deviant? Because in some ways, like, we want it to be pointed out that it's not socially acceptable to, have an attempt.
Yeah, I know, I'm torn, that's why
Yeah,
I'm I don't know if I think it's good or bad, because
Yeah.
I'm like, ooh, and I'm like, yeah, but don't we want to highlight that sort of like, okay, as a democratic society, we all agree that like, those are bad, that's bad.
And I think that I think the distinction between having extremist ideology and committing political violence is a really important distinction. And often they're kind of collapsed into each other when people talk about people being radicalized, right? And I think that pointing out that committing acts of political violence, like, it may not be unusual in the United States, but it is certainly like a radical act that breaks with the norm. Like, it's outside of our typical, like, what we would typically consider to be like an acceptable social action, in the same way that murder is not acceptable, right? Although we don't call murders radicalized. Murderers radicalized. So that's very interesting. I hadn't actually thought about it that way. I think that radicalization doesn't do much to really explain what's going on, and I don't think it really gets us anywhere. And that might be one example of something it does get us, is it gets us sort of a normative judgment on the people who fall outside of the boundaries. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much. I learned a ton from site. I have a question about discussion had in the word unprecedented. And one of the consequences is that if there is a hypothetical repeat of January 6th, it's no longer unprecedented. So how do you think this hypothetical repeat of January 6th manifest, given the changes in our media landscape since 2021, especially?
I highly doubt they'll start off with the word protest, right? I imagine that, I mean, considering that the coverage in 2023 of the event was used the term riot to describe January 6th so often, I assume that that's sort of what they will sort of hype up the landscape of fearing a riot, and then if something happens, it will very quickly translate into that. I don't think the media has quite read Scott's work yet. And I don't think that there will be some, scaled understanding of one particular word and phrase, but hopefully, with some kind of concerted effort, that could happen. But not protest. It won't start off that way.
One other thing I'd like to add, and I guess this is what we haven't been talking about, is the role of very open public organizing of coups, and the role like Facebook played in allowing people, and this also was present in my research on the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2016, is that everyone was RSVP'd to this event using their names, their Facebook accounts. And the important role race plays in that. Like, if there had been thousands of Black people registering with their Facebook account to organize a coup on the United States, I just don't think Meta would have kept that open. And so I think this, what I would love to see, as we should all prepare for what will be a very violent experience. I don't think we can just assume that this election is going to be okay. And so that's one thing I would like us to all just wrap our heads around. And then also in terms of platforms, recognizing when people are organizing out in the open, very clearly articulating these intentions, doing ride sharing, like sharing their Venmo account. I mean, this was like very open and explicit in both situations. And I would like to see some attention to that on platforms.
Can I add to that, Francesca, about the role of, I think this came up in what someone said earlier about, there was no level of secrecy here, as far as like, you know, didn't need to be surveilled, for example. And I think we've also recently had conversations that came out, in the subsequent, January 6th testimony and documents filed, where, and we've now heard from like the Justice Department where they say that, like, yes, we know, and we're actually going into this election where they say, yes, we know that these conversations are happening. I think this is more a question of who the state considers a subject that can be controlled and surveilled, which is a different question than whether or not we know and can cover them. And I just maybe expand the question to whether or not we've learned anything yet about what we are willing to do to control a threat and who we're willing to label a threat. And I'm not sure that's changed.
I am not sure it's changed. And I think, you know, also like the international research that looks at like, what are the things that have to happen for a country to stop its movement towards authoritarianism, right? And sort of move back closer to democracy. And maybe things are binary, right? All sort of on a spectrum. The thing that has to happen is the people who wrote the law to undermine democracy have to be held accountable. Like, across the world, that is like the thing that stops countries from sort of going in that direction. We haven't even done that, much less, you know what I mean, been able to say like, what lengths are we willing to go to? We haven't even like, you know, gotten to the point of the sort of very, easy, you know what I mean, aspects of like applying the laws that we do have to, you know, hold the person ultimately responsible for this. So,
I mean, that's definitely true when it comes to Trump, but I mean, a lot of people have been arrested for their participation in January 6th. And a lot of people were arrested for their participation in Charlottesville. And Charlottesville kind of cut the head off a lot of alt-right organizations. Like, I use the term alt-right historically because I think after Charlottesville, a lot of those organizations, they kind of fell apart. They weren't very smart people with great political organizing skills, and they didn't feel as empowered to, like, I don't know, I mean, I guess the Proud Boys are still at January 6th. Yeah, I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about like the Kekistan dudes and like all that, those kind of groups. But I do think there has been an impact on far-right organization, but I think a lot of that just means they've all gone to Telegram, which is much harder to
but even, okay, but also like, even if we look at Congress, like after the Civil War, the members of Congress who were part of the Confederacy were barred from being a part of that body. The members of the Republican Party of the US Congress, not all of them, but the ones who hours after what happened on January 6th, still voted against certifying the 2020 election, there's been no accountability. We have levers for that accountability. We have not held those people accountable.
You sure that?
Yeah. And so we haven't even done those things, right? And like, if we're talking about the organizations that are responsible for this, we haven't held that organization responsible.
But a big challenge is that it's not just the First Amendment in the United States that guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. That's a universal declaration of rights guarantees those things. And so there's a very fine line between shouting 1776 or, you know, whatever, and gearing into violence. And the way the United States handles this is through the legal system. It allows acts to happen and then, you know, addresses them after the fact. That's not the only model. Germany was, its current constitution was set up after World War II as a protective democracy to prevent the slide back into the kind of fascism. And it's a different way of organizing things, and maybe there's some lessons that we can pick up from that effort. But they're still struggling with the AfD party, so they've got their own problems. But clearly we're in some difficult times here, and I think that it is going to take a while for the legal system to be able to catch up and be as nimble as we might like it to be, because this part of federal law has just not been used very frequently. And we don't have a definition of terrorism. So it's going to take a while for those systems to catch up to the point where they're going to be more effective. addressing these infractions soon after they occur.
But I also think key to Tretti's, observation is that we also haven't radicalized what we think a threat is, right? Like, we still know which groups are considered a threat, and even this upcoming election is not necessarily widespread described as threatening to anyone, right? Like, if it does happen again, in a similar fashion, that's not a threat. I mean, this group isn't being portrayed as like a threat in the same way that if police kill a Black person in the middle of the street, cities immediately enact state of emergency because they may know people who may be upset, right? Like, we don't have a state of emergency issued for the United States government based on what happened, and even if we did, it's still not to be stated.
All right, okay, I'll give you the last question.
I have a question, which I'm torn. I've been thinking about it for a long time. What is your view about this change and more broadly the Republicans who call themselves traditionalists, who are never Trump? And I think on one hand, I realize, well, Liz Cheney plays a significant role in the committee, and also, on one hand, I realize that there is a fine line between the traditional Republicans and MAGA. A lot of the traditional Republicans' policy has really exploited racial resentment, sowing doubts about the government, creating the fertile ground. I think they played a role in it. But as Liz Cheney is now invited by The View and other TV shows, Stephen Colbert, and Stephen Colbert actually asked her to do something along the lines, but do you think you like somehow have a role in sort of advocating certain policies that left are? She didn't see any ground on that, but on the other hand, I realize that we need allies to protect and defend American. One chapter, that we need Republicans to fix the Republican Party, but they are the best Republicans we have. So if Liz Cheney is here with us.
By the way, we invited her. She shorted us $110,000. That's 100%. I came for only $100. I was her speaker, Steve. It's $110,000. Yeah.
How do you engage with her?
The standard model of persuasion that's very familiar to political communication scholars says that information coming from some neutral source or some unknown source that is not already trusted is likely to be deceptive. And that means that information that's potentially persuasive is going to get filtered usually by people who, when they hold views as important to themselves, and discounted if it doesn't already agree with them. I'm saying things that most people in the room already know. So if we want to break through the level of information that has taken hold in the Republican Party, I can't imagine a way to do that without people like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and others who have credibility within those spaces. Judge Ludick, also another important voice, to provide an alternative, a credible alternative within the Republican Party of how to sort of walk back from the precipice. I just can't imagine that we would have successful changing of minds without the involvement of opinion leaders like that. So that's the looking forward rather than the looking back part of your question.
I think what Scott described is true and important and clearly insufficient, right, for this moment, because we have not seen in all of our models of ways of thinking about this should have worked. not, right? Because then, you know, the maximum interpretability of that identity, right? And say, oh no, she's not that, right? And this sort of well-worn trend of in-groups and out-groups gets ported in over, you know what I mean, to people who would have been in group otherwise along, in this case, like partisan lines. So then I don't know, you know what I mean? Like, I agree, and like the, you know, all the evidence would suggest that's, you know what I mean, what we should, you know, be encouraging and be doing. Seems efficient. Yeah.
I just really quick say one thing. I mean, the opinion leader in the Republican Party, right, is not Liz Cheney.
Yeah.
And it's also, I'm feeling bad and I'd like to see something burn. Right, so unless you can somehow adopt the kind of style as Liz Cheney or someone within the party, who then adopted almost a quasi-conspiratorial style, but somehow was doing that in ways to marginalize the conspiratorial parts of the party and thus transform it, you can't really, like, it's not option, that's it. It's not about, if it's about a single leader, it's about Trump, if it's about this like rage affect, I mean, yeah, so sorry.
We will end on that hopeless note. Thank you all for joining us for the first panel. We now have lunch until 1 o'clock. Please join me in thanking our people who came in late. There's books on the table over here, and if you are looking for CLE credit, we're finding our QR code. And lunch is outside in the hallway. Okay, I'll be there. If you want to.